The very first public appearance of Jesus has given me something to think about this week. Matthew records it in his Gospel in chapter 3 and at verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up out of the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." What I've been thinking about is, why isn't God ecstatic? We don't seem to see a God who is jumping for joy at this great event. I don't know what the theological equivalent of punching the air would be, but one might expect a greater statement of joy and celebration. But we're told that the divine God is merely pleased. The Holy One simply says, "Very well." This is the response of God at the baptism of Jesus. Yes, the heavens open. There is a dove. God speaks from heaven. Nonetheless, God's response is not of extraordinary proportions. It's often said of people in my country here in Scotland, particularly the men, that we don't show our emotions very often. Well, I invite you to go into any football stadium on a Saturday and now on a Sunday and wait until the home team have scored a goal. And then you'll see grown men, all ages and all classes, shouting and cheering and singing their heads off. Yes, they're displaying their emotions. But this is not the kind of response we have at the baptism of Jesus. It is otherwise very muted. No, in a kind of coolness, the Creator God is merely pleased. Or another way to express it is that he's simply content. One would expect more, would one not? After all, according to Matthew, Jesus has been through a lot since making his journey from heaven to Bethlehem. He was almost killed by a deranged tyrant. He had to travel hundreds of miles to Egypt and to live there as a refugee. His parents could not return to their paternal birthplace because even the new ruler of Judea had some surly insecurity issues. But now, a few decades later, Jesus travels from this place, Galilee, to be baptized by John in the Jordan. All his trials, all his tribulations in human form have not been light, not easy for him to bear. But surely a baptism in the wilderness would garner some applause. Matthew is very enthusiastic in his writing to use parallels to have us consider what happens in Jesus' life as a parallel to many of the events that are recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we are continually asked to appreciate the parallels between the events of the life of Jesus and the way they have their parallels in the Old Testament. Our writer pushes the correlation between Israel's past and its present condition. Previous to this event, in the past few paragraphs, Matthew focused on Egypt as a refuge for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, just as it was a place of safety for Joseph after his brothers sold him into slavery. A pharaoh in Egypt feared Hebrew children, just as Herod displayed much angst over Jesus. After the Exodus, the Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And now in Matthew's narrative, almost 30 years after his sojourn in Egypt, Jesus meets John in the wilderness. So Matthew situates Jesus as a sort of embodiment or the theological fulfillment, the messianic answer for his primary Jewish audience. The new Moses has come to deliver God's people. And when we consider all of this, it's almost anticlimactic that God's only response to the baptism of Jesus is that of being pleased, being content, or to say, very well, that's it done. But to be fair, Jesus has done nothing yet. He has merely appeared. According to Matthew, Jesus has not performed any miracle. At this point, Jesus has not even spoken. It's a voice from heaven that gives utterance. Jesus is silent. There's no record of a parable, no record of a prayer, or any lesson on Thanksgiving. Jesus has just shown up. So while the Gospel of Matthew avers that Jesus will save, thus far in the narrative he has nothing to show for it. It does not mean that Jesus will not do anything. The birth story is clear that Jesus has much on this place. He will deliver people from their sins. And as this text nudges us as readers to think of our own baptism experience, it's also a passage about moderation. And that's the first of two thoughts that have come to me from this passage. This event provides, if you like, handles or guide rails on one's temperament in approaching to living out the Christian life. First of all, we are encouraged to embrace people. Jesus really does not need John to baptize him. John and Jesus recognize this. However, in order to align and to fulfill all righteousness, Matthew's Jesus does things in order. And we also have to humble ourselves enough to allow those who are God's servants to also equip us and to nurture us. Perhaps one of our tasks as Christians within the Christian community is to provide the space for people to be whom God has called them to be. Just as John was called to baptize, so Jesus gave him his space to do what God had called him to do. But then we're also encouraged by this event to embrace a proper way of doing things. Jesus could have baptized John. However, by allowing John to take the lead, Jesus acquiesces to what John is called to do. Jesus surrenders to John's work in the wilderness. Jesus honours the ministry of one person and does not discount its significance or viability. So Jesus does not circumvent the process so that he can get on with his mission. No, he honours the path that leads him to John and baptism in the wilderness. But Jesus also teaches us to embrace the place of preparation. And what I mean by that is that Jesus is in the wilderness. This is a place where outcasts, those on the margins of society, reside. Jesus has learned to live on the run, so to speak. His foray into ministry is no different. Although he received treasured gifts from the Persian elite, the Magi, as a child, his task as an adult would be to challenge classism and to challenge imperial regimes. What better way to accompany the marginalised then, to dwell where they dwell? And Jesus also teaches us to live with a little pleasure. John baptizes Jesus in the Galilean wilderness. There is no trumpet sound, no archangels herald this watershed moment. The Spirit of God descends, and a voice affirms that all is well. God is pleased. Our world demonstrates that excess is a sign of success. However, Matthew's baptism narrative contends a little moderation is good for our spiritual lives. God is content with what Jesus is about to do. So God is not ecstatic. The Creator is not jumping for joy. The divine is merely pleased. The Holy One simply says, "Very well. This is my beloved in whom I am well pleased." Wouldn't it be wonderful to hear God speak these words to us, that he is well pleased with us? Well, may I share with you today a final thought. If you are a faithful, baptized believer in Jesus, then what is true of him is also true of you. God is pleased with Jesus, and to the faithful, he is pleased with them. Thanks be to God.